All right. Thank you all so much for joining another episode of Celeste the Therapist podcast. My name is Celeste. I'm a
Yes.
therapist from Boston. I'm going to have my guest introduce himself to you all.
Celeste, what's going on? This is your favorite therapist, James Perkins. I'm a licensed therapist and coach in the state of North Carolina, and do individual and couples therapy here. But I have a special focus for Black men and Black boys, so people that look like me, share my experience, and consider it a very great privilege to do that. And I host a podcast called Bros in Therapy, specifically dedicated to Black men in pursuit of emotional wellness. Talk a lot about shame and how that impacts us. So I'm like excited to be on and be talking about one of my favorite subjects.
And yeah, we're going to talk about shame today. But so, I've had this podcast since 2018 and James has been on it before. He came on in April 2020, which was the beginning of the
Man,
kind of pandemic. It was that long ago.
yes.
And we're actually really cool in real life.
Right.
Actually like James.
Just had these stitches before we started this podcast. Man,
I hope
literally.
James likes me as well. Like, I think he thinks I'm a
Right.
great person. He's a great person. But James, how did you get into the field of therapy as a Black therapist? I don't know if you're aware, but they said there's like 3% of the therapists are Black, and you and I
Yes.
have been therapists even before the pandemic started, and I know we
Absolutely.
started to see a need. But what got you into the field of therapy?
Man, so long story short and shorter, I initially went to undergrad for accounting. I always had a passion for interacting with people, but also business. Went to undergraduate school, started off in accounting. Professors were great. Curriculum was fine. It wasn't actually hard. But I went to a conference in Atlanta called National Association for Black Accountants. And before I went to that conference, because I was a part of this organization, these big four public accounting firms would come in, take us out to eat, show us the ropes. So I started to get this sense like, man, that this was not going to take me as far as I wanted with interacting with people. So I was feeling this feeling. Then I go to this conference in Atlanta. And the first night of the conference, the presenter is speaking, and he is so passionate that it literally unsettles me. I'm like, I don't have nearly as half as much passion as this guy has. Like, what does that say about me? Because I'm about to devote my life to this career path. So further improbed me. I come back home. Church I was going to at the time, pastor was preaching. He made this one statement that literally wrecked me. He said, your passion is something that you love so much, where if it came to the point where you had to do it for free, you would do it. But because you do it so well, people reward you for doing it. And so I had to ask myself in that moment, if it came to the point where I had to do accounting for free, would I do it? And obviously, because I'm sitting here, the answer to that question is no. But the thing that jumped in my mind was counseling, and I didn't know all of the extremities or details of that. But I knew I had a great passion for holding space for people, sitting, listening, offering my empathetic feedback. And as I just kind of looked back through my history, I realized, like, man, what I thought was a normal gift or something that everybody else had, I essentially figured out that that was my uniqueness. And so I literally switched my major the end of my junior year of undergrad. So it's the most significant transition that I made, because I felt like this is what I wanted to devote my life to, and didn't look back. Finished undergrad. Took me only about an extra semester to complete. And then I went to grad school in Dallas, completed my studies, and eventually transitioned back to North Carolina and opened up my practice. But that's the condensed version. A lot more details, but that is essentially how I became a therapist.
Wow, James don't usually do condensed. That was pretty cool. James likes to talk.
Give you the story. I gotta take you along the path so you can appreciate the colors, the details. Yes.
No, I get it. I love that about you.
Right.
I didn't hear this story before. That was pretty dope. And
Right.
I mean, you were able to figure that out while you were still in school. Even though this isn't the subject we're talking about, there's a lesson from this. You know, I like to pull lessons
Yes.
out of dialogue. And for
Yes.
people listening, I think that's important. And sometimes I'll have clients, their 9 to 5 like pays the bills, right? And so I said, you know what? If that's the case, then what bringing passion into your life, even if you're not getting paid for it, like that's
Right.
it's hard to be fulfilled if you're not living the way you were designed, or there's no passion in what you're doing day to day, right?
It really is. And to that point, you're exactly right. I literally had a vivid vision of me waking up while I was actually considering switching. I had this vivid vision that I was going to wake up 15 years down the road. I would have amassed a certain lifestyle, because with accounting, it can be pretty lucrative, especially in public accounting. And I was going to be 15 years down the road. I would have a wife, 3 kids. My family would be used to taking vacations. Their education was paid for, and I would be miserable. Like I felt like I was like, man, I was going to go to work and be like, this is not what I want to do. But, and I'm not sure what color people are listening to this podcast, but I'm a Black man married to a Black woman. And I was not going to say, hey, babe, I quit my job today. I want to do something else. That was not going down. And so I was like, man, I need to make this decision now to do this, because our brother is not trying to feel trapped in 15 years down the road. And it is
thank God for that vision.
Man, but it's, Celeste, I know we're laughing, but this is so serious. Because people like are living this reality. They feel like, man, I don't have another way out. And so, especially when you have responsibilities, you can tend to put those to the side for the benefit of the people that you love the most, not realizing that it is worth you still pursuing your uniqueness and giftedness, because, as I say, we all are here to make a difference, but we have our difference to make. Like, we can make a difference, but what is your unique, specific difference that you're supposed to make?
And a lot of people, unfortunately, don't think about themselves, right? And like me and James, we joke around a lot, but because we do this work for a living, and we know there's a lot of people operating in life literally the vision that you had, right? Because society talks about all of these things is going to get us happy. That's why everybody's on Amazon every day and at Target,
right.
And not realizing, if we really look at the things that we have a lot of things, and a lot of people are unfulfilled because they're doing it all wrong. And so for you to think about it and be able to do that, that's great. And if for people listening, just because you've already graduated and you're in your career path, don't let that stop you from thinking outside the box about what can help you. We're not saying quit your job, but thinking about what you can do to add some passion to your life.
Absolutely.
It's good. I appreciate you sharing that. It was a little lesson that came out of that piece. And I think we really underestimate how much passion or that kind of fulfillment that passion that we allow to be used in a way that helps us feel good can help with fulfillment. And it looks different for everyone. It's going to look different for everyone, but don't stop yourself from looking into what that is for yourself.
Yes. And we'll get into this. I'll talk about this later on once we get to it, about how shame kind of uses that, our narrative and our story against us, and especially as relates to our sense of identity and purpose. So when we feel like we may have like wasted opportunities or that time is too far gone for us to recover, shame can really take advantage of us in those spaces. But we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, because James hosts a podcast and he thinks he's hosting this one, and we will talk about it when I'm ready to talk about it. I love bothering him. I'm so sorry. I'm doing it on air.
I'm your co-host for the day.
Oh my God. All right, we gotta focus. I'm so sorry. This is so
okay.
I'm so not like when I talk to people I know, I get like this.
Right. We are in rare form today.
Speaking of shame, because that's so I had a couple on my podcast, and the guy had brought up how he didn't want to carry shame. And the first person I thought about was James, and I asked him to come on to talk about shame because it's a theme that comes up so much. And I think if we're naming it, if we're identifying it, and we're not allowing it to carry with us, we won't feel as stuck as we feel. So I want to start off with like identifying what is shame.
Yeah. And you said two things there. One of the shame is this intense feeling, primarily feeling two things. One, that I am not enough. So it tries to play these two messages, these two tapes, essentially. One is I am not enough. Or if you overcome that message, it tries to play this tape of you don't have what it takes to fill in the blank, whatever that is. I don't have what it takes to do that. Therefore, I am not worthy of love, belonging, and connection. So it tries to play those two messages. One, I am not enough, or that I don't have what it takes. Therefore, I'm not worthy of love, belonging, and connection. Shame is the distinction I like to make here is that with guilt is more of a focus on behavior. Shame is a focus on identity. So it's just not about what you do as it relates to guilty, feeling a sense of guilt. Shame is about who I am at my core. And so that's a kind of brief definition of what shame is.
Wow. And the last part, who I am at my core.
Who I am at my core.
Deep. When you talk about like not being enough, you don't have what it takes. I think about how many people's history of like trauma or what has happened in their past can attach to that shame. What part of like trauma and history plays a role in this shame, perpetuating it the way it does?
That's a great question. So the interesting thing about shame in this intersection with trauma is, when a person experiences a traumatic experience, what is attacked or what is heightened is our alert system that has to do with fight or freeze. That same space that trauma deals with is the same space when we feel shame. It's the same area of the region of the brain that is alerted. And what is interesting though is that when you're in those spaces, when you are about to feel like the anxiousness that you need to either fight or flight, what happens is you get dysregulated because your cortisol levels are increasing, which releases that stress into your system, which impairs your ability to think clearly. And what we know about shame and when we're impacted by trauma is that it affects that prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain, which is in charge of like our executive functioning. And that's really important to understand because that executive functioning helps you to think clearly and practically about things. So it says and I hate to use this as an example, but I use it because it's a perfect one. Our beloved brother, Will Smith, in the Oscars on last year. This is a perfect example of this, of how shame was really in play. Is Will Smith had about 20 something odd steps to decide not to fully walk to the stage and hit our brother Chris Rock. Yet he didn't stop, because you know what happened? He felt the sense of shame. That same alert system was triggered. And it's important to know a part of the reason why he got triggered. If you think about his book, I Will, what Will often felt, going back to history, trauma, growing up was a sense of inadequacy. And he felt like a coward because he was never able to protect his mom from his dad. So replay the same moment, right? Chris Rock is picking on his wife, symbol, mother, wife. It's the same one. And her facial response triggers in him, man, it brings him back to that same moment. And so at that moment, right, he is not thinking about, man, this is going to be my first Oscar potentially that I'm going to win out of my entire career, the one that I've been trying to get that I've never got. So I probably shouldn't go to the stage and smack this dude. That's number one. Two, I'm not going to smack this black man in front of all these white folks. Like this, it's like none of this. It's like I probably shouldn't do that. I'm going to set the culture back really, really bad if I go and smack this dude. For real, right? But none of those things matter to him at this moment, because now forever, the memory that we're going to have of Will Smith, of his Oscar being given, is not the fact that he received the Oscar. It's the night that he hit or slapped Chris Rock in the face. Well, that's what shame does, is that when we are in those spaces of shame, it cuts off that executive functioning. That part of our brain goes dark. So we don't have access, we don't feel centered to really practically think about, man, how to get ourselves out of that spiral, because we're so either in freeze response, flight response, or we're fighting back, which is typically what men often do when they feel a sense of shame. They tend to exhibit anger, which is the safest emotion that we have for men to experience. Because if any person actually created space for a man to express his vulnerability and sense of shame, most people won't be able to take that. So the man knows, man, the only way that I can react to my shame is to cover it up with anger, which is why when a lot of brothers come to me, they're like, hey, I'm here to work on my anger. And as we start to really peel back the layers, I'm like, you don't really have an anger problem. You have a shame problem. It's just manifesting as anger on the surface.
Right, because anger is more acceptable, unfortunately, not just society, but even Black culture for Black men.
Absolutely.
You see the even on like social media, you'll see how like similar situations with men or women, like a man crying, what's wrong with them? Why you can't man up? As
Right.
if they're not human. And so even like my male client, like if they're like emotionally, like, oh, I think I got something in my eye, or it's harder to allow the tears to flow than my female clients. But that example that you gave with Will Smith, it makes a lot of sense. Like, and it's not about excusing behavior, but talking about how it can manifest in somebody's life. If somebody's like listening and feeling like they've been carrying a lot of shame, what kind of ways do you walk people through it? Because again, Will Smith can't go back and change the past of what he did.
Right.
Like, how do you move forward? And I think the shame of what happened for people, or maybe what they've done or not did. Maybe they didn't graduate, or maybe, there's just so many things that it's like we just stand still because we're carrying all this. What do you say to people? Like, how do you help them like work on their healing process with this piece of shame?
Right. A big part of what I do is helping people to understand their narrative and their story. Because shame is a narrative machine, if you will. It hides in stories, because stories are the most compelling ability that we have as humans. Apart from any other mammal on the face of the human earth, humans are the only creatures with the capacity for storytelling. So because we have that capacity for storytelling, shame is aware of that, and it knows how to consciously link memories, experiences together to bring, and this is so crazy because if you don't do any research around brain science and neuroscience, what you'll find out is for most of our thoughts that we think are like, we're just thinking of them, there really are thoughts that have been presented to us by our subconscious. And our subconscious is that storage system that, as I compare it to like a hard drive, it houses all of the experiences, encounters that we have had from the moment that we have been born up to the present moment. And it's just not housing the verbal language, but it's housing all the facial expressions, the moments where we saw our parents' face when we failed or disappointed them. Our brain is holding like that face, that sense of displeasure. That's that shame. And what we know from research is that a child can experience shame as early as 18 months because shame doesn't have to do with just verbal communication. It has to do with this embodied felt sense that we feel in our bodies. And so that's important because you can literally feel shame before you even actually have the words to even put around it.
Yeah, I want to pause you for a second. You're saying so much good information. For people listening, there are moments that you've had experiences that you may not be able to consciously remember that may have affected you and created, as you hear James talk about, research shows as early as 18 months, which I didn't know. I'm learning that today. And think about like being so young and having all of these experiences that you're not aware. And another big point that James makes, and I talk to my clients all the time about, most times our body's going to respond to something before logic clicks in. So you may not like consciously know what's going on. So it's good to be aware of how your physical is responding. So so those are like really like important points I want people to think about, because a lot of times people will be like, I'm not sure where this is coming from. But then we start looking at the body and I have them paying attention to their body and they start making connections. And this is where the narrative of how you start with people starts. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, because that once we are able to understand your narrative, it's the first place for us being able to identify where shame may be hiding in your life. So our normal development, for shame, for our beliefs, our core beliefs, essentially like for the first 18 years of our life, our core beliefs around self-esteem, our sense of worthiness, around success, around failure, around our relationships, these values are being created for us, but not by us. And that's an important distinction. They're being created for us, but not by us. So, as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, we don't have the capacity to dissect and determine that when a parent is saying something to us that, oh, that's not helpful. They're just saying that because they are mean and they just had a hard day at work. Kids are two things. They are self-absorbed. So they're little narcissists. They're all about themselves and they are very black and white thinkers. So when you don't spend time with them, they don't say, oh, mom and daddy, they just had a hard day at work. They take that personally. They say, oh, it's something about who I am. At 6, you don't have that capacity to say to yourself, man, yeah, mom and dad are just busy. So you internalize these things sometimes unconsciously before you have the ability to consciously later on in life determine like, oh yeah, they were just busy. So the only way that we have a chance to really evaluate our stories is to actually go back and ask ourselves, like, what are my core beliefs around success, failure? These are kind of like my entryway points because they're really big, broad categories that impact our life, like our sense of what we determine to be successful. These big, broad categories help serve as an entry point for us. So when we talk about success, failure, our beliefs about relationships, these are like really broad categories that help us to get into where shame may be hiding. And oftentimes I'm able to trail off from there, asking them about their encounters with, the caregivers. And from that, man, then it's almost like it becomes
Yeah.
alive. They start to really feel like, oh crap, like I know I haven't linked this before until you said this now. And it starts to take a life of its own.
Yeah, that's pretty dope. And we know a lot starts in the home, and when you talk about, and it's essentially what I do, right? I go through people's stories and I help them make connections and
Mm-hmm.
I help them shift the way they think. But when we talk about these core beliefs, because there's some people that will say, like, it seems like I feel like I was encouraged, blah blah blah, in my home. There's also
Mm-hmm.
culture and society that plays a role in some of the beliefs, and we may not
Absolutely.
even realize it. Is that something that comes up too in session? Like, for instance, like some people may not have a kid. Maybe they don't want a kid, but at their age, there may be like a different culture where women are supposed, not realizing they hold a lot of shame
Yes.
because they don't want to have a kid. Like, what are your thoughts about the way culture and society expectations play as a role in our some of our beliefs that we don't realize is there?
Man, it's so important because the culture is always sending us their explicit values about what normal is, and the culture is always sending implicit values, and it's through the content that we absorb. So social media, it is conversations that we have when we're at cookouts, and you're the sister who hasn't gotten pregnant or married yet, of your three sisters. So nobody is saying, "Oh, look at my sister; she ain't got no kids yet," but everybody's at the cookout playing with their kids, and you're just sitting looking like, "Man, I'm the only one here without no kids." So it's sometimes it's not even about what people are saying. It's about what we are internalizing, and absorbing from the culture, from what this system, if you will, puts out.
Yep, yep. That's good. And earlier you talked about humans being able to do the narrative piece. And also, we are the only species on Earth that can activate that amygdala with just our thoughts, right?
With just our
And
thoughts.
so if we are not mindful and renewing our mind on a regular basis, we're not realizing how much these thoughts are impacting us. It is like you said, it's not like somebody said, like, "Hey, Celeste, you don't have kids. What's wrong with you?" Sometimes they
Right.
do, but a lot of times it's just like
Right.
what that example you gave is a clear example where it's not like it doesn't have to be nobody directly saying it, but this comparison thing that you don't realize you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about
Mm.
that?
Man, it is so significant. I was with um, talking with a client recently. No, not a client. My best friend. He's also a therapist in Ohio, so we get free therapy from each other. And I was telling him about how sneaky comparison can be, because oftentimes, and people often say like comparison is like the thief of joy, which I think it is. But I think sometimes comparison can hide, like very stealthily, if you will, um, in our stories, because we are not um, grabbing for something. Like, so sometimes when people are comparing, they feel a sense of either one or two things, that they either need to react to compensate for that comparison or to diminish that sense of comparison, or people just hide it. They just never they never show it on the outside or even verbalize it to another person, which is why I think it's important when we feel comparison to actually name it, verbalize it, and if we have a close friend, to actually share it with them, to say, you know what, I'm struggling with comparison with fill in the blank. Because once you start to name it, this is the unique thing about what we've been both talking about. Once you start to name something, what your brain is going to automatically do is it's going to help you be able to point out when you are comparing yourself to such and such, or you're comparing yourself to where you're at in your stage of life. If you only hold it within, it doesn't have that, your brain doesn't have that capacity to be able to point out those things to you when you're actually seeing them unfold in action.
Yeah, that was a word right there. I would have passed out the offering, gave you a little
Right.
offering for that.
So
Nate, go ahead, finish your thought.
no, so this is why, I was talking about the brain. Like, the brain doesn't care what story that we wrap around the experience. It just wants to give us something to help us make sense of it, which is why comparison can be so deadly, is that it opens up the door for the brain to bring you a narrative that kind of helps you to make sense, but it might not be true. So you may say that in comparing yourself to, use an example I use about the woman who has sisters, all of them are married, they have kids, but she does not. So when she feels comparison, like, man, I don't have kids, my sisters do, what may come up for her to help her make sense of that story? She may say, oh, well, it's because I've been actively involved in my career, so I haven't had time to actually date and engage in cultural relationship to that point where, I connected, made kids or whatnot. But that narrative, man, that brain does not distinguish between what is a story that is going to empower us, and what is a story that is not going to empower us. And that's in part because of the two forms of memory that our brain has. So we have, and let me know if I'm going too fast here, if I need to, because I feel like I'm like, perfect.
No, yeah, actually, I was just thinking about, like, you're a really good teacher. This is like you're actually giving the scientific version for people to understand, like
Yes.
ABCs. So I just love how
Yeah.
you teach. You're really good at, like, helping us
Oh,
understand
thank you for this
what's happening.
compliment. I love you. I
Yeah.
love you,
Yeah,
Celeste.
yeah. You better.
But so we have what we call two forms of memory. We have episodic memory and semantic memory. So episodic memory is the memory that we form of memory that holds details that are not really important to the well-being of our life, but it's key to how we function. So our address, where do we live at, our car, it holds this data so that when we need to access it, we'll have access to it. The semantic memory holds and is interfacing with our subconscious all of our experiences that we've had. So with semantic memory, though, the thing about it is that our semantic memory is so subjective. So the episodic memory is fact-based. It is, my keys were left here. My car is blue Chevy. I have a blue Chevy truck. It's very fact-based. The semantic memory is subjective. It is, it fills in colors, details, but those details don't have to actually be true. They just have to have some sense of relevance that will help us make sense of the moment. And the thing about semantic memory is that the more that we think about an experience, the more our semantic memory will put in details that may not have actually occurred. When we actually have a conversation with somebody around a previous experience, like my wife, she might say, no, that car was not blue. It was yellow that we were passing. And I'm like, no, it was yellow because I remember it. And it's like, no, the car. And then we'll find out inevitably, like, yeah, that I was wrong. I was like, yeah, I think I remembered that wrong because that semantic memory was in place because it was something significant about that experience where I remembered this color of this vehicle, this person saying this. And this is where why trauma impairs our memory so much, is that trauma impacts our ability to actually reflect the actual sequence of events. When we experience trauma and we haven't resolved it, our minds put more in about what happened than actually what happened, which is why it can impact our sense and ability for shame and a whole bunch of other different things. But man, that memory is like, it can have a yoke on his not Leslie, Celeste. It can really have an impact on how we perceive our experiences.
Wow, that was really good. I know my audience learned a lot from that. And as James is talking, and it's something I tell people, like we got a whole world happening inside, and most of us are not involved in it, right? We're walking around very mindless. And the brain is doing what it's designed to do. I tell people that all the time, right? You said the brain. Oh, go ahead. You have a thought?
No, you're exactly right. The brain is doing what it's designed to do.
And you said the brain doesn't care about like how it happens. It's just working, right? And I think like in 2023, like, in this era that we're in, there's just so many things that can distract us if we allow it to, right? I never blame social media or other things, but I think that people don't understand just how powerful and important it is to engage in what's happening internally. Because if you don't, James just talked about the somatic memory, it will create a narrative on its own, and it will use the old information, that old tape of the trauma to help it. But if I'm reading books, if I'm listening to podcasts, if I'm in therapy and coaching, I'm like in community, my brain is getting new information. And so my brain is able to look at that and like really shift my thought process about my life. The fact that I'm in a very grounded space, I know who I am. I know my story. I had to go through my story. It makes the way I operate in life different. Because are there moments where that trauma comes up in situations because of that memory? Yes, but it doesn't define my lens, right? And so I think it's important to understand, for people to understand that, like, going through this work is very hard, but necessary, because if you don't, and if you've had a hard life, your brain only knows that life, right? We got to give it a new narrative. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely. You guys gave my Cliff Notes version. I'm going to take your Cliff Notes version. You are spot on. Great summary. I love it, Celeste.
We steal from each other all the time. No, I think this is such an important conversation to have, just because, some things in life that has happened, as we created it, some we didn't. And it's hard. I think when you think about it, like, why am I allowing something I can't change to continue to perpetuate in my life and affect the way I see life? I don't think people see it that way.
Yeah.
I know for me, I seen it like, oh, well, this happened, like this sucks. And it just felt like a downward spiral. Like, how could it be better because this happened? But thinking about it differently, like what Will Smith, I always quote him when he's like, fault and responsibility are two different things. And just thinking about, what, it's my responsibility to be okay. You know what I mean? If we take that on and realize, like, I can't never go back and change what I didn't do, what I did, what somebody did to me, what they didn't do. If I can only like think about it that way, that will give me like the hope or the drive that I need to work on being okay, especially knowing that my brain only has my old script. I need to give my brain a new script.
Man, I tell people all the time, if you don't like the story that you're living in, create a new one. Create a new one. And I oftentimes, so one of the questions, like I assess people or ask is like, what if you're living right now in a broken story? If the broken story that you're living in, which all of us to a certain degree have broken stories, if you drop that script, what will be possible for you if you decided to live from a new script? And, a part of this yeah, I take this from Donald Miller. He has a book called Hero on a Mission. And he talks about these 4 different roles that we all play, have inside of us. They are the hero, the victim, the villain, and the God. The victim is obviously the person, and we may feel like this at times, that feels like they have no sense of agency. So they don't feel like they can change their story. They don't even see that they even have the ability to even change it. Then you have the villain, that is obviously, and that villain is just not representative of people, but it can be symbolic of entities that represent things that are against us. So our fear, shame can be that villain, right? And then the God are the people that come alongside of us to help us navigate our story. And then that hero, which most people don't see themselves as a hero in their own story, but we all are the hero in our own stories. And I love that he defines what that hero is. Because, you know, when most people think about hero, they think of this strong, capable, impenetrable person. And what we know, right, from just observing is that heroes have flaws, and that a hero is essentially nothing more than a victim going through a transformation process. That a hero is nothing more than a victim going through a transformation process. So if we actually start to see ourselves as the hero in our own story and realize that, man, we have all been victimized, been victims of events, circumstances, but the way that we get to our hero status, if you will, is allowing people to be our guides. And sometimes that is therapy, that is the book, that is community. These are all forms of guides that are really helping us become our full potential so that we can show up and make our most profound impact.
I love that. And I don't know if a lot of people don't realize this, but it's like they're looking for somebody to save them. I was looking to be saved in different ways. I wasn't consciously aware of it, but when I look at like my relationship, I wanted it to be fixed through the relationship or through this. And now that like I have that fulfillment within, like I do feel like my own hero, like talking to you or being in community, that's an added bonus, right? Like, so it's not about that not being, like, it's not about it. Like if somebody's validating me, that's great, but that can't be my only source. Like to be able to be have the power within, something we don't talk about in this country because they want us to depend on them because that's how they make money. But if we can work on empowering ourselves by being that hero, the other thing, and then using the guides, especially in the Black community, we're so used to like bugging it out, keeping it in the family, like not really like looking for support, very independent. But if we can really work on allowing the guides to happen in different capacities or ways, I think that we can actually see like the power that we have. That's a dope, like I never heard that, but that's really great to think about it that way.
Absolutely. You know, I think when we really start to take ownership of our stories and become like, ultimately, like the buck starts with me, like full responsibility for our life, things will immediately change because you know, as I say, like the offense, if you will, the trauma, the damage, the abuse may be on the other person. You're absolutely right that they did abuse you, that this person did reject you, but your healing is your responsibility. No one is going to heal for you. You got to heal intentionally and by yourself.
Last story I want to share, our mutual friend, Pastor Sean Marshall, he shared a story about like being hit by a limousine. Do you remember the story?
Yeah, I think I do.
And he shared how like the car stopped. I don't know if it was a real story or if he was using it as an example, but anyways, the car stopped, called 911. And it's like, when you think about like, it wasn't his fault he got hit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the
Right.
car wasn't paying attention. It just so happened that this guy stopped and called 911. But imagine, like, we're using this as an analogy, but imagine if he didn't stop. Do you just lay there and just
Right.
wait and hope he comes back? Right. And I think
Yes.
that when we look at, and that's what, like, it wasn't this story that made me shift, but like, this is a story that may help people shift. If you look at it in your actual life, the damage was already done. Do you just
Yes.
wait for somebody to say sorry? Do you wait for somebody to come and save you? Like, that means you're putting your healing in somebody else's hands.
Absolutely.
And so for some people, this may be like a new way to think about it. But it's an important way to, my whole goal is to shift the way we think. And there's so much
Shit, the way
power
we think.
in doing that. And, listening to James share with us the kind of scientific knowledge behind what's happening in our brain. Like, if we knew this early on, I don't think we would stay suffering as long as we stay suffering if this was
Absolutely
embedded
not.
in us, right?
Yes.
I
Man,
feel like things are different.
we just perish, right? I think that when we don't have the information, we can't act when we don't have the sufficient information. And
Yeah.
so I think that's the challenge, right? Is getting that new information into us, like you said, so that we can give our brain more data, more stories to actually more positive, empowering information to choose from,
Yeah.
rather than those
Yes.
old scripts running in the background.
Yes. This was such a dope conversation. I mean, I didn't expect anything less of you. We could talk about things all day because of you
All
just have
day.
a really you're easy to talk to. And also the way you teach is just really easy to like absorb. And I'm a slow learner. So like like the fact that I was able to like pick this up is really good. Tell
Absolutely.
people how they can reach you. If they wanted to listen to your podcast, if they wanted to follow you, how would they do that?
Awesome. Yeah, you can check me out at jamesperkins.help. Or if you on Instagram, visit me, James Perkins Inspires, and connect with my work there. Like, I host a podcast. I'm actually so interested, and you're probably the first person I've told this, Celeste. I rebranded my podcast, Shameless Leader. We're going to call it Shame Untold. Haven't even told anybody this yet. You're like one of the first people to know.
Well, me and my
And
audience are.
you and your artist rights, and you guys take a look out for that in the near future, in part because when people hear shameless leader, most people don't think of themselves as a leader. They don't think of themselves as a person that actually has influence. And
You're
so we
so
wanted to
right. They would say like, this
right.
isn't for me. Like
This isn't
if
for
I
me,
don't
right?
like look at because we lead in different ways. You don't have to own a business. You lead in your home. You lead just yourself. But yeah, that's
Look.
smart. Yeah.
And so, yeah, because as I say, we may not all have a leadership title, but we all have leadership responsibility. And so I wanted to update it to reflect that, so that as people come across, they can, and this is so the whole position of the podcast is going to meet. I'm going to obviously be in part doing some teaching around shame and what that looks like in play. But also we're going to bring on people to talk about their own narratives about how they've reckoned with shame, how they're reconciling it. Because what we know is, oftentimes you're able to pick up on your own shame when you hear it in someone else's story. You're like, oh, that's what I've been feeling. When they said it, it's like it starts to click. It's like, darn, like, so, which is why I'm just a big proponent of like, you share your narrative, you share your story. Shame loses its power when we share our story, when we share our narrative. So I'm excited about that.
I'm excited for you. And the naming, again, I want to just emphasize naming something you're not, and actually I tell people, it's like, they're like, oh, I'm just anxious. I said, you feel anxious. And I said, well, why do you feel anxious? right? Like, because it'll just come as like,
Man.
I'm just stressed. Okay, what am I stressed about? Because
Right.
you're essentially telling your mind that, okay, we're going to be anxious. I don't know why we anxious,
Right.
but everything's going to make us anxious. So we, and then you think about shame. If it's not named, it's just sitting in us and it's creating its narrative.
Just
The brain's working, it's doing its thing, like,
yes.
all right, we going to be shameful. So we can't get anything done because we can't think straight. Our executive functioning is all jacked up. And if we knew this stuff, nobody would set themselves up for this lifestyle. Who gonna set themselves up for this lifestyle? They don't tell us this.
Right. I tell people all the time, like, nobody wakes up and says to themselves, I want to be a crackhead or I want to be on the pole. Right. Like, that's not how you grow up as a child. I want to be a stripper or I be a crackhead. It's not the career of choice, right?
I want to be evil. I want to be not available to my kids. I want to be like, nobody says those things. And it's so important for us to just start naming things and not giving it the power, especially understanding now that we understand how the brain works. Thank you, James. Don't allow your brain to create its own narrative. Such a dope conversation. I appreciate you, James. I hope I wasn't too hard on you and you would be able to come back.
Oh, absolutely. Again. Absolutely. You were, but it's okay. I love you. No.
Okay, I'm gonna have to cut that part out. I can't have people thinking Celeste the therapist is mean.
Will ruin your whole brand.
My inner circle knows I could be like funny mean.